The bench by the west fountain was shaped by the city's weather and other people's habits into a familiar vessel for Thomas Grant's mornings. He had come to measure time by the small, repeatable things that did not depend on sight. The soft click of the gate latch as the park keeper opened at 7, the pattern of pigeon wings against stone, the warm weight of his coat against his chest, the way the St. Lucie medal hung against his ribs when he moved his hand over it, a cold coin that smelled faintly of his own soap and the leather of the chain. On the bench, he kept a smooth stone from a creek near his childhood home. He rubbed it when he wanted to remember older versions of himself who had once known how to see a horizon and how to trust it. That morning, the air had the wet, green smell of recent rain and a faint perfume someone had left on a passing scarf, soap and citrus too sharp against the soft decay of fallen leaves. Thomas waited for the fountain's low hiss to settle, for the city's distant traffic to begin again. He liked the way the fountain blurred time. He liked how the world, receding, gave him space to listen. He had learned to listen in ways others did not. The neighbor who dropped a key in his driveway 3 blocks over and never walked all the way across to fetch it. The footsteps of a woman with a cane versus a man with heavy boots. Small things multiplied into a map. She came up behind him without announcing herself. He felt the air shift, lighter, as if a child had breathed, and then a small hand rested on the back of his bench. "You know where the ribbon goes," she said. Jada's voice was clipped, businesslike, edged by a kind of urban caution that made Thomas's chest ache in an oddly tender way. She was a small person, smaller than he had pictured from the stories Naomi had told him, but she had a bone-deep stubbornness that filled the gap. He turned his head a fraction toward the voice, guided by memory, and reached out with his left hand. Her fingers closed around his. Her grip was quick and certain, like a promise. "You're early," he said. His voice was not the polished public tone it had once been. It carried year and loss. The world had made his words smaller, but their shape remained. "Wasn't supposed to be here," she said, "but I saw the lights on. You always come on Tuesdays. I know." He smiled at the ritual. "You have a good clock." She dropped her hand and, in one careful movement, pressed something into his palm. It was a stone, damp, cool, stamped with grit. He felt the grooves with his thumb. It fit in the hollow of his hand like a secret. "You found this?" he asked. "No." Her breath smelled faintly of street.
Dust and something sweet. Someone had handed her. An orange peel, perhaps. "I did. In a bed by the east wall. Judith's gardener's been wrong when they sweep, but they throw smarter things away. This was on a ribbon. Thought you'd want it." He remembered the ribbon before he remembered the stone. A slender piece of blue cloth threaded through his metal many years ago, tied by a trembling housekeeper who had not known which way his life would go. The ribbon had frayed and been replaced, tended like a fragile covenant. He fingered the metal at his throat, calling up the shape of the saint who, in legend, had a merciful steadiness when sight failed. "Thank you," he said. The words sounded like a ledger being closed. Jada sat at the opposite end of the bench as if she belonged there, scraping the toe of her sneaker against the wood. There was an economy in the way she placed herself, half waiting, half on patrol. When she spoke again, the words were small and precise. "She ain't here for you," she said. The bench hummed with the city around them, but Thomas felt the phrase lodge like a pebble in the shoe of his mind. He had not placed the girl at his center until that sentence. Judith with the white-gloved gestures and a laugh that had once been able to make him forgive the world, had been a steady presence in the house and in public. She had sat beside him on stages and in boardrooms, read prepared lines when his visibility made headlines, leaned in at the right times. People liked the story, a brilliant CEO humbled by an accident, surrounded by devotion. Thomas had never liked how it simplified him, but he had let the narrative stand while he rebuilt himself, while he measured each step. "Not here for me?" he asked, and his fingers tightened around his stone. Jada's knees bounced. "She's building something, Mr. Grant. She says she's saving you. But they put things in the safe. They talk about trustees, guardian stuff, who'll sign when you can't." She punctuated this with a tiny, sorrowful, adult-like exhale. Seen it, heard it. You can't sleep sometimes, and folks say it's because you're tired, but maybe they mean sleep you down. Thomas's pulse shortened into a coherent rhythm of alarm and caution. He'd been careful, too careful sometimes. Trust labeled as business necessity, love as a useful narrative. He thought of the last time he had woken with a fog that was not only in his head. A morning when Jennifer, the nurse he had trusted, had said with a smile, "We'll get you some rest, sir. It's been a lot." He had closed his eyes and obeyed. The world of care had thumbs in medicine and calendars and consent forms. People with titles wrote small authoritative notes on behalf of him, and his signature had been replicated, mobilized, never quite explained. "Who saw this?" he asked. She named names.
Gardener, night nurse, the driver who listens but don't say, Judith's lawyer, Carl. They're always talking with the garage lights on. Heard talk of trust and voting. That woman, Naomi, she comes when there's trouble, but Judith's voice is louder. Naomi's name was a relief and a twinge. He had known Naomi Price since the last boardroom fights. She had defended him when others wanted him out. She had a taste for legal detail and a moral muscle he trusted. He could feel, in the space the name occupied, a path back from the cliff edge of rumor. "Did you tell anyone else?" he asked. Jada's tongue clicked against the back of her teeth. "I told Miguel once. He said to keep away. Told me if I want to help, tell the blind man." "There's a lot of telling," Thomas said, and at the edges of the jest was a real gratitude. "Why me?" She shrugged, and the motion was authentic and ungenerous, the kind a child might have after years learning not to be owed much. "You give me stones. You listen. You're not like the rest. And you got a ribbon." The ribbon, the stone, the small logos of someone's steadiness were enough to make him believe. He had guarded himself with legal teams and a public relations schedule, but the world had a way of introducing new variables at his threshold. Jada, who slept sometimes in alleys and sometimes in church basements, who knew which pot at the community kitchen warmed the soup longest, had nothing to gain in a boardroom. She had nothing to negotiate. Her truth was like a splinter that would refuse to be comfortable. When he rose eventually, the bench remembered him. Miguel's footsteps were a little late. The driver had been ordered ahead, but approached with cautious efficiency, the sound of his shoes punctuating the pavement like a metronome. Miguel's hand, warm and reliable, clasped Thomas's elbow with a tenderness that had the clarity of a map. "Someone talk to you?" Miguel asked. He had the careful, low voice of someone who had served many masters and kept the shape of a new loyalty. "Someone," Thomas said, "a child with good ears." "Jada?" Miguel smiled in a way that was half relief, half pride. "She's sharp." "Tell Naomi I'll need to see her this afternoon," Thomas said. The ribbon and the stone felt like small explosives in his pocket, their potential energy waiting. Miguel's grip tightened. "We'll take care." They did not know then how quickly "take care" would have to translate into action. Naomi at her townhouse smelled of coffee and paper and a litigant's nervous adrenaline. She arrived in a flurry of legal notepads and a brow line of quiet impatience. She sat at the edge of his sofa and set down a file thicker than she needed for civility. The two of them fit into the small room, and in the hush that settled, Thomas could hear
the city breathing beyond the glass. "You were right to call," Naomi said. Her tone was a blade wrapped in velvet. "Jada's reliable in a way people don't expect. She takes risks because she has to. She has a way of being honest because honesty is free. He told her everything the girl had said. He told her the ribbon and the stone, the tiny shifts in the house, Jennifer's smiles that lasted too long, Judith's pocketed phone, the odd scheduling of appointments, and the way his own signature had appeared on documents he did not remember signing. Naomi listened like someone folding a map. "We don't accuse someone without evidence," she said. "We can't just go to the board and say, 'My fiancé is trying to steal my life.' We need proof. If it's as you say, unilateral moves to change trusteeship, transfers that were not authorized, we build a file. We get a restraining specification on the corporate side. We petition for medical counsel oversight if sedation is being used improperly. There's a process." "You'll get it," he said, the sentence both a command and a prayer. Outside Naomi's office window, Walker moved through a different kind of space. He had been in the margins of Thomas's life. Once a fixer who smoothed edges for contracts and threats, who took on the dirty work and sold the clean result to the public. After the accident, he stayed because his hands could make complicated things seem simple. But there are transactions that wear down a person. The edges where loyalty and expedience met had cut him. When he left the direct employ of the house, it was not because he had grown polite, it was because conscience had become a weight. He came to Naomi with a tireless, penitent haste and an evidence folder folded under his arm. He smelled of the street and gasoline and a man who had spent too many nights awake. When he sat, he exhaled as if he had been holding a breath for a long time. "I was there," he said. "I did the stuff I shouldn't, but I also buried things I shouldn't. I can help you find them." Naomi did not look surprised at the confession. She had worked with the kind of men who arrived repentant because the law wanted them on one side. She asked the questions that a lawyer asks when she is arming herself: dates, places, materials, people with names. Walker spoke in bullet points, each one a small confession. Paid invoices for nurses at odd hours, a ledger that did not reconcile with county records, a safe deposit key that had been moved into an attorney's name. "And the driver?" Naomi asked. "Miguel?" Walker hesitated. "He kept a thing. He's loyal but quiet. He heard things. He didn't tell because he thought it was for your protection." When Walker left, Naomi folded his folder into the larger case file as if tucking a wound closed. She stood then and went to the small digital recorder on her desk. "We get a preliminary restraining," she said. "We subpoena records, bank transfers, medical logs. We get the nursing notes. We take depositions where we can. And Mr. Grant," she looked at him with something that was not strictly kindness, but an honest alignment, "we make sure you have a say in every step that concerns you." He needed words as much as he needed actions. "Do we have anything tangible yet?" She tapped the recorder, the single blunt sound of modern proof. "Not yet. Walker says there are things he can get us if we move fast and smart. We'll use the board calendar, push for an emergency meeting if needed. Tell me the names of everyone who has had access and I'll start peeling. We'll keep Jada away from the mess as best we can. She's brave, but not evidence." The plan began to shape itself like a skeleton in the dark. Thomas imagined, for a flash, an unfamiliar room, a board table with a dozen suits gathered, the squeak of leather, the soft tremor when power finds the wrong kind of momentum. He felt his chest prickle with an old, slippery fear. How quickly people rearranged the world to their advantage. The first piece of something solid came from Miguel. He was not a man of many words. His loyalty had a shape of silence. He returned to the house the evening after Thomas's conversation with Jada and listened. He listened for the cadence of meetings, the sound of drawers, the slither of a safe folding into secrecy. One night, while Igor, the night gardener, moved mops and the blinds were thick with dark, he heard the soft rattle of keys in Judith's bag. He felt then a discomfort he had kept like a pebble in his shoe. Miguel knew the pattern of the house as much as he knew the weight of Thomas's footsteps. He waited. When the chance came and a bag, small, leather, was left briefly unattended in the service hall, he slipped his hand inside and found a USB drive in a thin case. The drive was unremarkable. It clicked into Naomi's laptop with a small ease.
The file on it was labeled simply, in Judith's neat script, Meeting_notes 0417. "You asked Walker for leads," Naomi told Thomas as she rested her fingers on the keys. "We'll see if this is what he said." Thomas listened to the room with his whole body as Naomi clicked through. The laptop hummed. The file opened like a contained breath. On the recording, voices were layered in a way that made the skin at the back of his neck rise. There was the smooth, measured register of Judith, always a practiced cadence, and beneath it a lower voice that he thought he recognized but could not immediately place. They spoke in corporate rhythm, of trustees and votes, of contingency plans and securing the board. But then the shape of the language changed. It bent toward personal urgency. "She won't know what's
happening," Judith said at one point, her voice clipped by the quality of the recording. "We make the scheduling, and the paperwork takes care of itself. When he signs, it will look like his idea. You know how the public likes a narrative." "Is he lucid?" the second voice asked. A hint of worry or ethics, Thomas thought, and it scraped at him like a fingernail. The answer was a sound that declared evaluation. A name, Jennifer, said in the same low tone his nurse might use, meditative and professional. "Mostly," Judith replied. "He's fine when we keep him on the rhythms. He sleeps through the hard parts. It's kinder." The word kinder fell like a small stone into the bowl of Thomas's belly. He had never heard Jennifer speak this way in the recorded cadence. Jennifer's voice, when it rose, was butter-soft and rehearsed. It described sleep like a concession, and as if his agency were a matter of convenience to be negotiated. Naomi watched his face, saw the flicker. "It gets worse," she said, voice hollow. "We'll need to trace when those permissions were recorded. Who authorized doses? Who signed the orders? There could be medical over-medication evidence, yes, but that's delicate. We go through the hospital logs, the pharmacy records." He pressed his thumbs to his metal without really thinking. The metal was cool, an anchor. A second file followed, one Naomi had not expected, a video. She had not asked for moving images. She had not hoped to be fed a scene. The file was time-stamped in the small hours, a home camera angle nobody had told them was active. The recording showed hands, not faces, a table, and the whisper of clothing against wood. Thomas could feel the scene more than see it. The scrape of a chair, the scent of aftershave and lemon polish, the soft clunk of glass. On the recording, someone set a glass of tea down beside a folded contract. The camera did not show Thomas's face, which it would have if he had been present, but it did show the smoothed signature on a page. A voice, Judith's, calm and insistent, talked about timing, and another voice, Thomas's, murmured something that could not be made out. The implication was a choreography. Words softened, a pillbox clicked, a hand that guided a pen. Thomas's throat tightened. He did not want to see the image. He only wanted, now, humane mechanism and clarity. Whether someone had taken advantage of him, taken the shape of his consent and folded it into something else. Naomi's fingers were precise. She closed the laptop and tapped the recorder, like a definitive punctuation. "This is enough for a temporary injunction," she said. "If the board is being reconstituted to push you out, we can freeze certain transfers. We can file for emergency conservatorship to ensure no unilateral medical decisions occur. We have probable cause for an investigation." Even with relief there, Thomas felt the fatigue of having to claim his life back in layers of motions he had expected to have spent years escaping. Somebody was moving the furniture of his world. People who loved stories about him had been content with an accessible version of him that allowed for heroism and pity at intervals. The real world required a harder, more pedestrian kind of courage, paperwork, persistent logic, the grim mechanics of evidence. They moved fast then, in the legal-minded way of people who had long practiced urgency. Naomi wrote, called, and filed. Walker moved again, his old instincts returning to fetch things he had hidden when guilt finally outweighed profit. Miguel kept his eyes and ears at the villa. He became a sentinel in a uniform of servility, the kind that shows up and does not ask.
Jennifer, when confronted, folded like a person who had been asked to serve and then to justify serving in ways she had not admitted to herself. She was not monstrous, she was a suffocating loyalty that had become indistinguishable from convenience. Naomi treated her as a witness, then as a subject, then as a human in need of counsel. Judith, when Naomi told her nothing but the law's absence, no mention of accusations, only of formal processes, behaved with a theatrical calm. She called Thomas on his landline in a voice lined with reservoired hurt. He listened to her words like a man hearing marble struck. She spoke of devotion and stability and the difficulties of old friends who did not understand their sacrifices. She said the right phrases, themes she had honed. She spoke of them as if they were co-authors of a script the city loved, charity, legacy, and a shared public face. "You know me," she told him. "We've built our life together." Sometimes Thomas could hear how a phrase had once been true in its entirety, and how that truth had been laminated by convenience. People are habit-making creatures. Habits can be weapons. "I know you," he said, and the syllables were measured. He had to be mindful of his own voice, careful not to give the public something to consume that would become a narrative against him. Naomi counseled calm. Walker counseled aggression. Miguel counseled silence. In the shop of memory, Thomas turned over small things he might have missed. The night the car came back a little muddied, just at the edge of rain. The extra signature on a vendor contract whose figure did not match what he had planned. Judith's insistence that his schedule be uninterrupted. He had accepted as many hands offer him what they called mercy, the easing of pain, the smoothing over of thresholds. Mercy had a shape, and sometimes that shape was a taking. One night, as autumn sharpened around the city, Thomas woke with the taste of metal in his mouth and the sense of a shadow in his bed. The house smelled of lemon polish and something else, an antiseptic note that belonged to a place where hands had authority over wellness. He felt the mattress move. He heard the soft thudding of a bar being raised and lowered. Someone checking doors, perhaps, or a nervous habit. He waited until the sounds receded and then reached for the recorder he carried like a talisman. His thumb found the small, ridged wheel and clicked it to life. A single beat of raw promise. It was Walker who discovered the notebook tucked behind a false panel in the back of a drawer in the guest quarters. A notebook Judith had kept for meetings, not the kind of thing you expect to be crucial, but a repository of shorthand and gestures. Inside, in hurried hands, he found references to sedation plan and vote lock, to Naomi leverage and guardian increments. There were numbers that looked like account routings, but were annotated by initials. Walker did what he used to do, and what made the old guilt wake up. He copied everything. He also found a receipt for a device, a small home monitor that reported sleep quality, purchased and registered under a nanny's alias, where the alias was a name that circled back to a nursing agency that supplied the staff who had the house's closeness to Thomas. The mesh of guard and convenience had been used to establish patterns, records, monitors, logs that could all be read as benign when placed in the right light. The more they gathered, the clearer the architecture of the plan looked, and the more personal it felt. It was not enough, Naomi warned, to be morally outraged. The law required proof and a chain. Recording devices had to be admissible. Chain of custody had to be intact. Walker had to explain where he found what he found. Miguel had to testify without betraying the man whom he had served to keep. The child who had started the whole chain couldn't be in the front line. Naomi insisted on that fiercely, like a mother guarding a small flame. Jada was good with small things. She had a knack for being invisible and for seeing the seams people left in their armor. She slept where she could be safe, and when Naomi met with Thomas in a quieter room of the community center one afternoon, she found the girl sitting on a low step, feet braced, fiddling with a ribbon of bright blue. "You must be careful," Naomi told her when she came out. She crouched at Jada's level because that was the right posture for speaking clearly to a small person. "This is serious.
We need you to stay away from the house. We'll do the talking. You did a brave thing, but we don't let brave children go to court." Jada's eyes were fierce and level. She glanced once at the St. Lucie medal that Thomas wore, felt the cold of the coin against her palm where he had let her touch it that morning. "I don't want to be in a court," she said. "I want him to be himself. I don't want people to sleep him into other people's words." Naomi's hand found Jada's shoulder and held it, strong enough to steady. "We'll take care of the sleeping part," she said, and there was a promise heavier than a plea in her voice. They built their case like craftsmen. Naomi threaded the legal loom. Subpoenas, emergency filings, a swift motion to freeze certain corporate actions. Walker and McGill supplied leads. Naomi brought in an independent medical consultant to review records, taking care never to phrase their suspicion as a diagnosis. The consultant's notes, layered with clinical distance, mentioned inconsistent documentation and irregular administration times, and flagged the possibility of sedative overuse for further investigation. Naomi framed this with care. Their goal was not to humiliate, but to protect. Then, on a rain-stung Tuesday evening, when the city smelled of exhaust and wet pavement, Naomi and Walker and Miguel sat in his living room, while Thomas, with his hands on the small recorder, listened to the cartridge Naomi had insisted be duplicated and preserved. Walker had brought another small flash drive, one Naomi had not anticipated, slid into a crevice by an embarrassed man who wanted to make amends. When she clicked play, the room narrowed to a focused, audible corridor. The voice that came through first was Judith's again, soft and untroubled. "We need to ensure a consensus," she heard. "Imagine the headlines. Generous fiancé secures her partner's peace. They will thank us later." There was a rustle of papers, the clink of cutlery in a distant room. Then, slower and more intimate, a voice that sounded like Thomas's, slurred perhaps, or made thin by a veil, saying something that could have been assent, or could have been the residue of sedation. "That won't—" Naomi's fingers hovered. That voice, was that edited? Walker swallowed. "He was woken for a meeting once. I saw them bring drinks. He was groggy." "Can they make him sign?" Thomas asked, the simple question of an adult who had been legally powerful at one time. It was not merely rhetorical. He needed to know whether the machinery of people could lift a pen and make a life change in his name. "They can," Naomi said, steady and precise. "If they can prove consent, and if the signatures are in order. But the recording, if it shows coercion or sedation at the time of the signing, it can undercut consent. We have to show the context." They listened to the rest. Judith's voice was serene. She spoke about trustees with the casual brutality of someone making a business decision. The voice of the second, whomever, Carl Ramsey or Jennifer, intervened, saying something like, "We will be careful." The recording was not a cinematic revelation. It was messy, punctuated by gaps and the soft noise of a house that preferred its secrets to be whisked away. But it was a hinge. It offered a direction for Naomi's carefully set legal scalpel to cut into. She would take it to the board. She would demand a hearing. She would press for an independent review of Thomas's medical administration. Outside, the rain settled into a quieter hush. Thomas found himself pressing the creek stone to his lips, a superstitious gesture that felt like prayer. He could not see the storm passing over the city, but he felt its weather in the low, steady thud of rain on the roof. Java's small presence in the doorway, Miguel's chosen watch, felt like a new constellation forming at the edge of his orbit. They moved then to organize the emergency board meeting. Naomi wrote a crisp, unornamented letter demanding immediate attention, laid out probable cause, and called for the temporary suspension of certain house privileges. The motion's language was surgical, designed to do one thing: protect Thomas's agency while the law unfurled its slow, bureaucratic muscles. Judith responded with a counter-narrative that had been honed in teams and rehearsals. She called the filings talk of public relations trouble, and in a voice made of practiced woundedness argued that such actions might be disruptive. She sent Carl Ramsey, a man whose voice was constructed of absolute certainty, to question the chain of custody of whatever Naomi claimed. He was a boxer of arguments, a man who punched holes in evidence with the ease of someone experienced in the theater of persuasion. But proof had a stubborn way of changing the play. Naomi secured a hearing with the board, citing fiduciary duty and the risk of unilateral actions in matters of medical care and trust arrangement. She demanded copies of certain contracts and records. She moved so quickly that Judith's group reacted with a flurry of PR statements, sympathetic portraits of a devoted partner trying to protect a vulnerable man. The night before the hearing, Thomas slept in a way he had not for months. The house was quieter. His staff had been asked to stay at a distance. He held the creek stone like a rosary, and let the St. Lucie medal rest heavy against his chest. He had never wanted his vulnerability to be the currency of pity, nor his blindness to be the stage for dramatic salvage. He simply wanted to stand upright in the life he had built with his own hands and mind. He had lost sight, but not the ability to know when someone was taking from him by erosion rather than theft. Morning came with a gray and near-silent rain. Naomi drove him to the corporate headquarters with Walker and Miguel in the car behind. The boardroom smelled like lemon oil and leather, and the tension of many people trying to stay polite while wielding power. Thomas's palms found the table when he reached for it, and he steadied himself with the rhythm of touch. Judith sat at the head of the table with a composed face that was both practiced and brittle. There were others, board members, chairs of committees, whose faces he could only know by name, but he did not need to see to feel their attention settle on him. The room hummed with the low conversation of people who took the governance of money like a sacred duty or a sacrament of status. Naomi presented the evidence with the clarity of someone who knew how to translate emotion into admissible fact. The recordings were played, the files were distributed. Walker's account and Miguel's testimony were laid out as document and witness. The board listened. People in suits shifted. A man cleared his throat. A woman, older and gray, listened to the ends of sentences with the mix of curiosity and the weary discipline of institutional governance. Judith leaned forward once, her fingers steepled. "Mr. Grant is my fiancé, and has been since before his accident," she said, her voice a controlled metronome. "Everything I have done has been to protect him." "There's a difference between protection and preemption," Naomi replied. "We are asking for oversight, respectful but necessary oversight. There is evidence of irregular medical administration and the possible use of that administration to obtain signatures or decisions Mr. Grant might not have otherwise made." The room did not decide on sentiment. It decided on paper. The directors exchanged looks, called to staff, and discussed precedent. A few asked measured questions about process, about how the filings might affect reputation. There was a sense of people calculating risk, the old fiscal arithmetic of red lines and public image. Then, as the day folded, the board convened a closed vote. While the vote was cast, Thomas sat with the creek stone in his pocket and Jada's blue ribbon folded in his hand, a private liturgy of things that kept him steady. He felt as if the world had been deconstructed into actions and proofs, and that the part of him that had always been public, his name and brand and the company's balance sheet, was now being tested against the smaller, truer reality that a human being has the right to remain subject to his own decisions. The vote was not unanimous. That would have been too easy, too Hollywood. But enough of them, moved in favor of a temporary oversight that would, at least for now, prevent unilateral medical or fiduciary shifts. Naomi's motion prevailed. Judith's reply was contained, a mask of composed hurt. Privately, at the park bench once more, Thomas felt a strange thinness in his chest. The decision had not unmade what had been done. It had not erased signed papers or undid the long evenings he had let others smooth over. But it provided a legal stitch, a bandage that gave the law time to unfold. The house felt different after the vote. People moved as if trying not to be noticed, as if the shape of what had been normal had been reframed by a judicial boundary. Walker dropped off a small packet at Thomas's door in the middle of the night, his hand shaking. Inside was a stack of documents and a thin flash drive. "You're doing the right thing," Walker said. His voice was exhausted and simple. "I can't
fix everything, but I can bring pieces." Thomas took the drive to Naomi. She nodded, a small, private smile, the reward of those whose battles were legal and therefore often thankless. "This could be the key," she said. "If it contains transaction logs or audio of people making explicit plans to change trusteeship while Mr. Grant's capacity was compromised, we use it." They plugged the drive into a secure machine with the care of people handling a fragile relic. Naomi opened a folder labeled audio_final. There was one file with a timestamp from days before the board meeting. She pressed play. For a breath, there was the low hum of background noise. Cutlery, a kettle, a knife scraped along a plate. Then, a voice. Not Judith's at first, but someone speaking in an edge of exasperation. "We need him to feel like it's his idea." The room around the recording resolved into definitions. The faint laugh of someone settling a plan into place, the careful articulation of steps, the mention of a notary, the suggestion that some added rest during the signing would make it easier. Then, clearer than the rest, someone's voice said a sentence that landed in Thomas's chest like a dropped cup. "He can't be making informed decisions at that hour. We'll ensure the paperwork matches the narrative." Thomas's thumb pressed into the St. Lucie metal until it hurt. The coin was a coin, but it had become a map of the way people could call themselves caretakers while erasing the person they claimed to protect. Naomi turned off the machine. She was quiet for a long time, and then spoke with the exacting calm that had become her armor. "This is beyond rumor." Thomas felt something shift then, not a sudden restoration of vision, but a radical reclaiming of his personhood. He had been mostly silent for a long time, largely because silence had felt safer than accusation. There are moments when a life defines itself anew in the breath between two decisions. The recording was a key. Outside, the rain had stopped. A ribbon of light tracked over the wet pavement, glinting like a scripture that did not demand belief, but offered evidence. In the distance, Jada's laugh, small, unscripted, rose from a corner of the center where kids were learning to string lights for the coming holiday. She had come with a thermos and a pack of stale crackers, the kind of small offerings that were the currency of the world she lived in. She had given him the stone and set the rest in motion. And now she leaned against a lamppost, watching, unseen and steady. "Thank you," Thomas said when Naomi did not need him to speak, when his voice could be a small instrument of appreciation rather than a demand. The words were blunt and true. Naomi slid the drive into a sealed case. "We're going to use this at the hearing," she said. "We're going to ask for a criminal referral for further investigation." "We'll keep you safe, Thomas. We will make the steps you cannot see count for something you can feel." There was still work to be done, and there would be consequences that would not be kind. Judith would fight. People would line up to defend or denounce. The public loves a good betrayal. It worships narratives about fallen heroes and conniving spouses. But truth had a way of making itself known in small evidences. A recording, a ledger, a child's observation. Thomas rose then and walked to the window. He could not see the world beyond the glass, but he could sense the rain on the pane, the city's minor, steady, persistent life. He imagined the bench by the fountain and the warm weight of the stone in his pocket. Jada's small presence by the lamppost felt like a promise that the world could be altered by people who had no power on paper, but who had, in their hands and in their small acts, the capacity to witness. The hearing would be tomorrow. Naomi would bring in witnesses. Walker would have to stand and explain himself, and Miguel would hold to his dignity while he said what he had seen. Jada would be kept away, their little vessel of truth honored but protected. In the quiet of his apartment, with the St. Lucie medal clutched like a compass and the creek stone warm from his pocket, Thomas made a decision to be less small in the face of what had been done. He would speak. He would trust the legal scaffolding Naomi had set up. He would let his life be the testimony it was, messy, tactile, and stubbornly human. When night came, he found on his doorstep a painted ribbon pinned to a small card. On it, an anonymous hand had written only a single word: "C." He pressed the paper to his chest and felt the truth of the word in the same place he had felt Jada's small, fierce insistence. Seeing had never meant only the eyes. Seeing could be the courage to look by other means. In the morning, as the board reconvened, and the rooms filled with the low murmur of men and women who had long felt themselves custodians of other people's lives, Naomi rose and presented the new evidence in a way that framed it as not only legal but moral. She played the files. She watched the board respond, watched faces lose their polite polish as facts cut through plausible deniability. And then she laid out the most delicate proof: a chain showing nurse schedules that matched the times of certain signatures, pharmacy records that mapped to the days of key instruments, and finally a recording where Judith's planning voice intersected with the practical recommendations of a nurse who spoke about making things easier and keeping him calm. It was enough to compel the board to call for an independent inquiry. It was enough to suspend documents that would have transferred.
Authority. It was not everything. It was the beginning of an unpeeling. When Judith left the room, her face close to the mask of control she had worn for months, she passed a man in a corridor who had known them both earlier in life. He watched her go and then turned to Naomi, whispering, "We must be careful about the public's appetite." Naomi did not answer. Her hands, folded around the evidence, were steady as a surgeon's. Thomas stepped outside into the slack air and heard, from the direction of the community center, the faint, human sound of a drum circle. Children were practicing for a celebration. Someone was singing out of tune, but with pure intention. He could not see the light, but he felt the movement of it. Warmth, a low chorus of people making a place. He walked to Central Heights Park after, his fingers trailing the bench's welt until he found the wood. He set the creek stone in the curve of the bench and tied the blue ribbon to the chain of his medal in a new knot, not the old one. The ribbon smelled faintly of dust and something like hope. He let the medal lay against his chest and closed his hand around the stone. A sound at the edge of his hearing made him look up. No, made him turn his head in the practiced way of someone who navigated by listening. Jada moved through the trees, the scrape of her shoes familiar, and she settled near him without fuss. "You did it," she said simply. "We did what we had to," Naomi said from the dimness near the path, and she approached, her silhouette a legal armor softened by loyalty. Jada looked at Thomas with an honesty that made him feel like a man being seen clearly for the first time in years. "You got your eyes back," she said. He laughed then, a short, hoarse sound. "No," he said, "my eyes are still the same. I got something else." "What's that?" she asked. "People who will stand with me," he answered, "and the knowledge that I can still hold my life." She made a small noise like a satisfied animal and then passed him something, a small piece of ribbon, an extra fold of blue. "For the ribbon," she said, "so you know where to tie it." He wrapped the ribbon carefully around the medal, tied it, and felt the knot like a pledge. He placed the creek stone beside the ribbon and felt a small kind of ceremony settle over him. The work would not end with knots and hearings. There would be courtrooms, there would be the slow untangling of signature lines and medical records, there would be the public's hunger for a narrative that would have to be fed or starved according to the truth. But the first, most treacherous step was taken. Someone had listened to a child and taken her seriously. Someone had translated that listening into a collective action that filed away the mechanisms of theft. When Thomas left the bench that afternoon, Naomi at his side, Walker watching from a distance with the tentative humility of the newly contrite, he felt less alone. The city opened like a book whose pages had been turned by a new hand. The St. Lucie medal warmed under his coat, and the creek stone in his pocket was heavy with the memory of other kinds of seeing. That night, in the quiet of his living room, Thomas sat with the recorder and the flash drives laid out like small islands, and pushed play once more. Not because he needed to hear the wrongdoing again, but because he wanted the sound of truth to become the furniture of his days. He listened to the voice on the recording as it made the plan plain, and in it he heard the outlines of the future: a hearing, a suspension, a careful undoing. Later, when he would stand in a room full of reporters and answer questions with a dignity he cultivated like a practical garment, he would remember the small things, the coagulated human proofs that had turned a rumor into a record. He would remember a child's hand on a bench, a borrowed stone, and a blue ribbon that smelled faintly of dust and integrity. For now, he turned the recorder off and smiled at the dark. There would be a battle yet in the boardroom, and possibly in a courtroom, and there would be people to forgive and people to hold to account. There would be the slow, unpredictable business of rebuilding a life that had been redistributed without his consent. He let the thought sit like a small beacon. Outside, somewhere in the city, Jada slept under a blanket in a place that was not a bed but was guarded for her. Naomi sent a driver to drop a warm sandwich on a stoop she would not be invited into. And Walker went back to his corner of the world with the uncomfortable grace of a man who had done a necessary wrong and then tried to make it right. Morning would bring more hearings, more documents, more prying eyes. But for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt steadier in the knowledge that the life that belonged to him would be fought for, with proofs and with people, and that the tiny, stubborn truth of a child's observation could tilt a board meeting and call a house's quiet into the light. He sat on the bench the next morning and rubbed the creek stone between his fingers. The St. Lucie medal warmed where the ribbon lay newly tied. In the fountain's low thrum he felt something like an answer. Not a miracle that would restore his sight, but an unfolding of justice that might restore him to himself. Then Naomi's phone buzzed in her pocket. She read the message and looked up, flat-faced. "They found something," she said. "What?" Thomas asked. Another message. An explanation in 2 words that stretched into a field of consequence. Forensic audit. Naomi's fingers tightened around the recorder. "They want a deeper review of the nursing schedules," she said. "And there's more. The audit flagged an offshore transfer that lines up with certain estate accounts." Thomas turned the creek stone in his hand until it was warm, as if the motion could rub the world into a more honest state. "Then we keep going," he said. Outside the park, in the rain-streaked light, a small mural was being painted on the community center wall. Children and volunteers working, brushes in hands that were clumsy and wide with joy. Somewhere in the strokes and colors was a figure with a hand reaching out, and someone had painted, in bright blue, a ribbon. The days to come would demand a steady, careful courage. But this was where he had landed, among people who would take the small, humane actions that made moral life legible. He placed the creek stone on the bench and tied the loose ends of the ribbon into a little bow. Then he rose, his hands finding his way, and walked back toward the city's pulse, steady with the sense that what had been hidden was unmasking, and that the truth, fragile as it was, would be enough.